Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and as always, I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And please continue to stay well and stay safe during these times. Speaking of such times, now we find ourselves, of course, in October 2020. As part of the festivities, as it were, I've been trying to upload a video a day speaking to a TV series or film that in one way or another, in my view, has some kind of spiritual connection to the current season, which is the Halloween season. So today I'd like to continue on with that, with a film that has an incredibly important place in the history of cinema, as well as being a prime example of what might be deemed to be the cinema of the psychological, or a swirl of visual and thematic ideas that are a deep reflection of the dark corners of the human psyche, as well as being a really unforgettable and groundbreaking example of the potential, the outright deep potential that cinema can bring. This is a film from 1920 from Germany, and the director's name is Robert Wiene. The name of the film is Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari, sometimes referred to in English as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And you'll have to please forgive me for my poor pronunciation of the German language. But as I say, this is a German film, and so I will be trying to make references where possible, given my very limited skills in German, which are next to nil. But I will try to make references where necessary. But going back to the film for a moment, this is a film that is a labyrinthine triumph. It is a truly eye-catching, visually dazzling, deeply disturbing work that is filled in profoundly exciting ways with confusion, with the unknown, with mystery, with a sense and an air of the unpredictable, with horror, with the psychological morass that can be associated with deep, dark confusion and the loss of individual identity and the fracturing of the mind and the spirit that gives way to something that could be deemed to be bleak and dark and unknown and unforgiving. This is Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari. And we have to remember, of course, its place in history, 1920, the Great War, the uncertainty of the world, and a lot, of course, would come subsequently, after 1920, of course. But given the situation, given the great, profoundly shocking trauma that has emerged on the world landscape, thus seeping into the minds and the souls of people, this film emerges. And what do we have here? We have a film that is about a doctor and a mysterious man, a monster perhaps, so Dr. Caligari, and Conrad Veidt's character Cesare, and we have this mysterious visit to this town and the mysterious goings on. What sinister happenings, if any, are the responsibility of this particular pair of characters. And thus lies, I think, the very essence of the story of the film, Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari. However, of course, as with any great work, we have so many layers, and this is no exception to that. The layering of this film is intense. It's incredible, and it's high octane. And we have to start, of course, with the look of the film. The look of the film is, it's often described as being cinematic expressionism, or often termed German expressionism in cinema. And while I don't claim to be a film historian or art critic or art historian, my understanding of what this means in giving, in the context of the film Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari, is the depiction of jagged landscapes, of fractured environments, of exaggerated shapes, and of exaggerated to the point where they become unreal. And yet at the same time there is this really fascinating, uneasy relationship between the unreal, exaggerated setting of the backdrops and the buildings and the backgrounds, for instance, on the one hand, and the integration of real, live, walking, living characters as they're portrayed by the actors on the other. So we have this uneasy merging between the unreal and the real. And oftentimes this can be described as being a form of exaggerated expression that can be seen to be maybe theatrical, in the sense as theatrical meaning, in the way that I'm trying to describe it, as being the reliance or connection with the backdrop in order to further propel some aspects of the story. And I think that is, in my understanding, I think that's a good way for me anyway to try to approach this film, because in essence we do have a story in the foreground and stuff, the imagery that is warped and the perspectives that are stretched out and things that are seemingly forced in terms of their perspective, or in reality they are virtually impossible. And so they can only exist in the realm of the cinema, or to be even more specific, they can only exist in the realm of the fertile imagination of the human mind. And so therefore we can extend that thinking to get a sense of the cinema somehow trying to grapple with the notion of the expression of that which takes place within the human mind. And so I think that is, in my approach to it anyway, how one can perhaps describe the ideas portrayed, the visual style, the expressionistic style as portrayed in this film. And if we can take that further, we can see that if the film is and I mean this in a positive way, an uneasy balance between those aspects that are obviously very over-exaggerated and very stylized, and also the integration of walking, living, breathing human beings, the actors and the characters, I think we see an uneasy alliance, which is a good thing, because there is a discomfort and disequilibrium that is automatically generated. And that in turn creates this sense of unease in the human mind as one is watching it. And I think that's one aspect that's very important. The other aspect, of course, that is very important is that if we look at the film itself, we see, therefore, that if we can look at it as being a reflection of the uneasy, fertile imagination of the human psyche, then I think the scope of interpretation becomes quite boundless and very exciting indeed. And we can take that further to mean that the film can be seen to be an attempt to embody within the framework of a cinematic grammar, trying to embody the disturbed mind. And this is shown in many avenues of the film. So the reflection of the disturbed mind is seen, for instance, in the decor and the settings. We see, as I indicated, jagged edges, things that seem to be tearing into each other, perspectives that are illogical in the real world, but they make sense in this world of Caligari. And there is something of an oppression, there is something of a dismemberment or illusory nature, there is something of a split fracturing, and the world becomes topsy-turvy and unbalanced, as though it's about to tip over and create complete chaos. So this, I think, can be said, therefore, to be, in visual terms, a representation of some kind of imbalance as being expressed in terms of the human psyche as portrayed through cinema. Okay, so that's one avenue. The other avenue is, of course, through the stories and the characters as they're portrayed in this film as well. So we have sinister characters, mysterious characters, Cesare and Caligari, of course, being at the focus of that. But it's more than meets the eye, or is it? There's always a question mark when it comes to who these characters really are, who they think they are themselves. Is there any kind of struggle, internal struggle within them? Does that cause a split? What do we call it? A split of personality or split of emotional alliances? Or something more, so that split equals a kind of fracturing, if you will, of the mind and the spirit and the soul, thus furthering this thematic, let's say, progression, or this expression, if you will, that is supported by the visuals, namely the fracturing of the spirit, the unknown, the question mark, things not necessarily being what they are, or things maybe seeming one way, but in fact are quite the opposite. And we see that also expressed in the characters in the story. Things go one way, but then they turn in a completely different direction that catches us off guard. And so we have to try, as viewers, we have to try to reassemble. But the film doesn't let us reassemble and doesn't give us the luxury of trying to explain it all away, which is, I think, a furthering of this confusion, of the fracturing, of the upended dynamic that is ever-changing and amorphous, and yes, oh yes, quite chaotic. So that is another way, I think, that this film furthers that. And I think, finally, we have to just take a step back and think, once again, about the historical context. Germany, the Weimar Republic, and 1920, and we have to understand, again, I'm speaking in very general terms, but if we think about the state of societies in the world post the Great War, post World War I, as it would later be called, then we can understand that perhaps there is a sense of loss, there is a sense of imbalance, there is also a sense of a real shock to the system that was expressed on a very macro level, in terms of geopolitical relations, but then has ramifications all the way down to the very micro and the very individual soul, and thus making us question who it is we really are and what it is we really strive to be. And these very fundamental questions can oftentimes lead to very deep, dark, and quite disturbing answers. And so I think that in itself is a reflection of what this film is trying to capture. So in those ways, I would suggest that this film is very multi-layered. I've tried to express it in ways that I think are befitting in terms of my own skills of expression. But as you can tell, my words fail, because I am far from being an expert here. But as I try to express it in my very, very simplistic, overly simplistic way, nonetheless, I do recognize the great power that this film has and always will have, I dare say, because of the fact that it seems to be striking a real nerve that is oh so fundamental to the human spirit. There's something that is being addressed here that it seems very essential. That seems almost to be a building block of what it is we think as being the human experience. And it has to do with fear, and the fear in confusion, and the fear at being in a place where we don't know what's going on. That's further elicited and further it's further activated by these external stimuli that we see: visions, hallucinations, images, objects that are out of whack, out of place, warped, hallucinatory, and quite fantastic in the realm of the fantasy. And we're not quite sure what it is we are doing or what it is we are aiming to do. But whatever it is something that we sense deep down is very deep, dark, and disturbing indeed. I think that is at the heart of the effectiveness of this film, directed by Robert Wiene, Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari, one of the all-time classics of cinema. And to end, let me say that this film is 1920, 100 years old, which is a remarkable thing to think about, because we can also appreciate the fact that it's a 100-year-old film that has had such a long-lasting impact, I dare say, on cinema. The imagery that is conjured up in this film is something that we can see having such a great impact on genre films, on horror films, on avant-garde works that were created subsequent to this into the 30s, 40s, and even now, whenever we see films that have a dreamlike, nightmarish, hallucinatory-based imagery about them, I think we can oftentimes associate that with the Caligari influence and the mode of expressionism from German cinema writ large. And so I think all that has to do, or we can see the seeds of that and the heart of that through films like Caligari and others. But that is to say that I think the influence and effect and impact of a film like Das Kabinett des Caligari cannot be overstated enough. It's truly a monumental work of cinema that is still very effective to this very day. So this is Das Kabinett des Caligari. Du musst Caligari werden. So, my dear friends, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you're well. And until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you once again for your time, as always, my dear friends, and cheers.